And in the first instance, I suppose I will take the opportunity to wish the Minister the best of luck in the new role, and I look forward to working with her on issues of concern to Ireland and our interests. The question just relates to, I suppose, the way that it is framed in relation to engagements with the government of Ukraine in relation to ongoing conflict and efforts made to reach a ceasefire. Unfortunately, some of the discussion in recent weeks, though, has some of the proposals that are on the table are rather partial, and I think have unfortunately undermined the position of the government of the Ukraine. That is regrettable, but ultimately I think we are all hoping for a peace that is sustainable and just, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's responses to the Irish Government's situation.
Thank you, Deputy, and just to say I look forward to working with you and all colleagues on many matters. At this critical juncture for Ukraine, almost 4 years of brutal Russian aggression, I want to emphasise Ireland's unequivocal support and solidarity with Ukraine. And this is something that I have emphasised a number of times, most recently having attended the meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council on the 20th of November, where Ukraine's Foreign Minister Sybiha spoke about recent Russian attacks against Ukraine. A meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council on the 26th of November yesterday also took place, which was also addressed by the Foreign Affairs Minister again. I welcome the ongoing efforts of President Trump and the United States to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and to achieve, as you've said, Deputy, a just and lasting peace and security, not just for Ukraine, but for the wider EU and Europe. It is more important than ever that Europe and the United States continue to work together to achieve this. The emerging US proposals, as well as plans for further negotiations, represent a step forward. I welcome the progress made at Sunday's meeting between the US and Ukraine in Geneva, and we look forward to these talks continuing in a positive manner to further progress being achieved. Ukraine is engaging positively and constructively in these discussions, despite the ongoing Russian military assault on its towns, on its cities, its ports and critical energy infrastructure. It's crucial that any agreement upholds Ukraine's sovereignty and independence based on respect for the principles of the UN Charter. The fundamental principle that borders cannot be changed by force must be upheld. Any agreement must also protect Ukraine and Europe's vital security. That means strong, credible guarantees that ensure Ukraine can defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity to avoid a repetition of the past. And as you've said, Deputy, while the proposals in the plan that was put forward by the US are welcome, there are very clearly areas that need further work on, and I'm sure that that is exactly what is happening at the moment. It's not just vital for Ukraine, it's also vital for the European Union and all Member States, including Ireland. It is welcome that assurances have been given that the EU and Europe will be involved in discussions on issues that directly affect us, including enlargement and immobilised assets. The Taoiseach and I remain in close contact with our European and Ukrainian counterparts. The Taoiseach himself took part in a meeting of the European Council on the 24th of November and attended a meeting of the Coalition of Willing on the 25th of November. That was on the margins of the EU-Africa Summit, and I'll come back on further engagement.
Deputy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Well, I think it was last week that we had statements on Ukraine, and every time this arises, it's an annual occurrence, perhaps more than annual, and every time it occurs, many contributions reflect the fact that the hope that the next time that such statements happen, that there will be a ceasefire. Unfortunately, the war and the assault on Ukraine continues unabated. In recent weeks, we've seen some appalling attacks, including in Ternopil, but other locations as well. Civilians being targeted, civilian infrastructure being targeted. So the context of that is very difficult to see. I think it is near impossible to see that Russia's interest in peace is in any way sincere. I think for a long time they have been merely paying lip service to that. I think it is unfortunate the confusion that exists in relation to, obviously, the role of the United States in mediating, and if they are taking on a role in mediating peace, that is welcome, and clearly they have the potential to play a leadership role. Unfortunately, what has been emerging has been somewhat confused in terms of what is being said by Marco Rubio on one hand and by Steve Witkoff on the other hand. I think that this has made the position of Ukraine difficult. What is the Irish Government's assessment of what currently is being proposed by the US Government?
Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. Could I maybe just agree with your initial comments? My own view, and I think that of many Member States, and this was reflected in a recent meeting, is that the actions of Russia, it's not a country that is seeking peace. That's very clear, not just from the fact that innocent civilians have been killed in recent days and weeks, but also the fact that there continues to be persistent hybrid threats to neighbouring member states. So our friends in Poland told us very clearly of an attempt to, and in fact an actual blowing up of a train line, and only for one device didn't detonate, there would have been significant casualties. Similarly, hybrid threats happening in airports in nearby countries in Lithuania and others. So these are not the actions of a country that wants peace. I do genuinely welcome the engagement of the US and their efforts to bring forward a peace. Again, I have to stress that the 28-point plan that we saw initially over the weekend, there were very clearly elements of that need further work, but I think it's welcome in recent days, not least the engagement between the EU or the US and Ukraine, the 3 EU, so the EU member states and the EU institutions been involved in those discussions, and more recently the very clear indication from President Trump that the deadline of today is no longer a deadline. I think it shows a clear commitment on all sides, separate to Russia, to reach that agreement. So we need to make sure that all sides are putting pressure on Russia to come round the table to realise that long-lasting peace, and to make sure that it is a peace that will not just have strong implications for Ukraine, but very clearly for the wider EU and the European region in general.
Deputy.
I think I would reflect on the fact that arbitrary deadlines are challenging at the best of times, but arbitrary deadlines with the goalposts keep shifting is even the more challenging. And I think it is important that the time is taken to properly calibrate realistic proposals that, you know, this is about justice, but it's also about sustainability, ensuring a sustainable peace, and a peace that is not, I think, just, and that doesn't respect the rights of the people of Ukraine will ultimately fail to be sustainable and will only embolden. I'll take the opportunity as well, the work that the Irish government and other governments have done in relation to the abducted children, several thousand of them, is very important. I hope that you will continue that work. It is a profound crime. It's a crime against humanity, to my mind, and it's hard to imagine the pain and grief that this must mean to individual families. But I think it is also an assault against the Ukrainian people. So perhaps you can outline how you intend to advance that particular work and ensure that there is justice and accountability.
Thank you, Deputy.
Crime.
Minister.
Deputy, we will continue to support all efforts towards a peaceful resolution. In the meantime, and separate to that and in conjunction with that, there are other ways in which we can provide support and assistance. So in relation to the forcibly transferred or deported Ukrainian children, we will continue, and I will continue to raise this at every avenue possible. We've been clear in condemning what is a crime, an absolutely horrific crime, in taking young children from their families. We are engaging with UN agencies to try and find other solutions to this issue, and I will consistently raise it with my colleagues at the Foreign Affairs Council, through our UN agencies and with the High Representative. In terms of other ways in which we are providing support, we will continue to provide financial support, making sure that where humanitarian aid is needed in Ukraine, that we provide that, but also where there's non-lethal support that is needed, that we will also provide that. We're also being very strong in our support for Ukraine's accession. It's really important that Ukraine and others see their pathway towards membership of the European Union, and from the very outset we've been very strong in providing that support, and we want to make sure that that continues, and certainly through our presidency it's something that we'll be focusing on very strongly.
Thank you. Okay, we move on to question 2, and that's group with question 4. So Deputy Smith, you.
Thank you, Chair, and I just want to genuinely wish you all the best, Minister McEntee, in your new role, and I'm sure your experience in your previous ministry, European Affairs, will be a great grounding for the work you have ahead. My question this morning is seeking an update on the prohibition of settlement goods bill, which has been the primary bill in terms of the public's attention in terms of this calendar year, and it's been on the statute books for 7 years in some form, and I'd love an update this morning to see how it's progressing.
Minister?
Grouped, I think.
No, well,
Yep.
yeah, you want.
Yeah, well, look, sure, look, I'll wait for the minister's answer. Yeah, sorry, that's the way it works.
Minister Shearer, I let Deputy Smith back in, and then Deputy O'Leary on the second and third.
Perfect, apologies. In June, the Government approved the general scheme of the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory Prohibition of Importation of Goods Bill. The main purpose of the bill is to prohibit the importation of goods into the state from Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Trade held a number of hearings on the general scheme and received submissions representing a range of views and perspectives. Pre-legislative scrutiny is an important part, as we know, of the legislative process, and the Taoiseach to thank the committee for its report on receipt. Detailed work to analyse the report and its recommendations is well underway. The regulatory impact assessment is currently being finalised also by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and will be available on the Department's website when completed, and I hope that to be soon. The next steps in the process, including the timeline for the progress of the bill, are being considered by Government. The general scheme fulfils our commitment in the programme for Government to prohibit the import of goods from settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. Trade in services is considerably more complex than is the case with goods, and there remains considerable legal uncertainty as to whether the inclusion of services is permissible under EU law. Legal clarity is needed on this point, as this is something that I as Minister want to receive. I made it very clear, though, at the very outset when being appointed to this role, that I intend to fulfil our commitment in the programme for Government to enact the legislation. We must also take account of practical issues with regard to the implementation should services be included in the scope of the bill. It remains the Government's preference that collective action would be taken at an EU level. We continue to pursue this, and so in this context, Ireland has welcomed the announcements by the Dutch, Spanish, Slovenian and Belgian governments regarding the banning of importation of goods produced in illegal Israeli settlements. We know obviously that these were introduced prior to the ceasefire taking place, but it's really welcome for these announcements by the Dutch, Spanish, Slovenian and Belgian governments, all of whom we are working closely with. Notwithstanding the positive and welcome developments with regards to a ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza, Ireland has also made clear its view that the EU must keep the package of measures proposed by the Commission in response to Israeli human rights and other breaches on the table. This is something that Ireland essentially started to raise and led the charge on, to make sure that there was a significant response and that this was kept on the table, and it is very much firmly on the table. The primary focus at EU level right now is ensuring the success of the ceasefire, the peace deal, and of making a contribution to international efforts in this regard, as well as making sure that the humanitarian aid that is so badly needed, that can not just continue to flow, but that it increases, because there are very significant concerns in terms of the number of young people who are facing starvation if the number of trucks do not increase significantly. It is essential that peace is given a chance to succeed. It is absolutely essential that the humanitarian aid and assistance that is needed, that is allowed to enter into Gaza, and this Government in Ireland will do everything in our power to make sure that we support both of these objectives. Thank you.
Report was delivered. On the 2nd of October in this chamber, the previous Minister for Foreign Affairs said it was his expectation that the bill would be before the Dáil by the end of November. Today is the last sitting day of November, and obviously that's not happening. Now, between the 2nd of October and now, I'd like to ask what has happened and what has changed. You said in your initial contribution that there remains legal uncertainty. What work is the AG doing to unravel that legal uncertainty? Have you set a deadline as to when you wish to receive legal certainty on services? I mean, we believe there is legal certainty on this, and this was well aired and demonstrated during the pre-led scrutiny stage. So this feels like it's being unduly delayed. Also, on the economic impact side, we're awaiting a report, it seems, from the Department of Foreign Affairs. Have you set a deadline for when that report is going to be delivered to you, and what pressure are you putting on the Department of Foreign Affairs to bring that? Deputy O'Leary.
Let me first say, I suppose, that the Occupied Territories Bill still matters. It has always mattered. I think it mattered long before the last 2.5 years of slaughter, almost 3 years, that has occurred in Gaza. It was all the more important during that period because it's important that every state that wants to stand against the genocide uses what leverage it can. But it mattered before that, and it still matters, for the reason that ultimately the position of the Irish government, my position, many other people's position, is that we want to see a sustainable two-state solution. What the Israeli government is doing is continuing, even now, against the back of a ceasefire. A ceasefire, it's difficult to call it that when hundreds of people have been killed by Israeli forces during the course of that period. But amidst all that, we've seen attacks on people by settlers, we've seen incursions, we have seen continuing to undermine the two-state solution. The ceasefire cannot be, in so much as it is a ceasefire, it cannot be that we freeze here and we leave it at that. Clearly, we need to see pressure put on Israel to ensure that this two-state solution is made sustainable.
Thank you, Deputy. I suppose the Irish Government's position has been very clear. Our overall objective is that two-state solution, and we have been working towards that for some time now, not just in recent years. That has always been our goal and our objective. That is why we recognise the State of Palestine. That is why we are doing everything to ensure that this peace is lasting. That is why we are hosting a Global Alliance Summit in January this year, bringing together heads of state to show how we have, on our own island, progressed a peaceful resolution to what was a long-lasting, ongoing conflict. We want to do everything in our power to make sure that the territorial integrity of Palestine, that it is upheld, and so that will be our continued goal and our objective. In terms of the legislation itself, I've given a very clear commitment now as Minister just in the last week that we will fulfil our commitments in the programme for government. You'll appreciate in the last week, or it has only been a week, so what I'm looking for is the Attorney-General's advice on services. Again, I think we've always been clear that in terms of services and enacting legislation, it is more complex, and so I await the advice from the Attorney-General. I haven't received the draft bill, but I do anticipate that I will receive it soon. And again, in terms of the work that's been done on the impact assessment, again, I expect that that will be ready soon. So again, you'll appreciate as a Minister only a week in the department, I want to make sure that I have all of the information available to me to be able to progress this legislation, but I will work with colleagues on all sides of the House, because again, I am absolutely clear we need to do everything that we can as a country in our power to bring what is a very fragile ceasefire to a more permanent ceasefire. We need to make sure that we continue to use whatever levers are available to us to hold people accountable. And again, I acknowledge that since the ceasefire there have been killings of innocent civilians. That's why it's really important. The measures against the EU-Israel agreement are very firmly on the table. This was raised at the last Foreign Affairs Council meeting that we had, and I'm very pleased to say that it is firmly still on the agenda. And myself and other colleagues made it very clear that this needed to remain on the agenda because we cannot have a situation where the ceasefire has been broken on either sides. But again, deputies can be assured of my commitment in making sure that we make progress here, but also in making sure that we continue to support the Palestinian people in what is an absolutely dire situation at the moment.
Deputy Smith.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. But notwithstanding your short time in the job, this is the only piece of new legislation that's come through on the Foreign Affairs brief this year, and it's not, a small piece of legislation. It's had a well airing. You spoke about it yourself on national media as a member of government this year. So, I think at this stage, I think the people of Ireland, opposition TDs, I think we need more certainty in terms of the timelines. I think just saying it's going to come soon, legal advice is going to come soon, I don't think that's good enough at this point in time. So we would like timelines as to where this is going to happen. What are the issues in relation to the legal uncertainty? And also, you did mention last week that you may have to have some discussions with the Americans or American politicians in relation to this. I would again like more clarity in terms of your plans in that regard, because it does feel that this is being unduly delayed with a wall of silence at this point. Thank you.
Following on from that, I think any communication with any politicians in America or anywhere else must make it clear what exactly this legislation does. It's squarely within the footprint of international law in terms of the occupied territories. That is what it is targeting, and not anything else. A couple of points just on the legal side of things. Look, and I find this debate rather frustrating. Like, we've been told that there's legal uncertainty. To me, it seems difficult to understand how it was possible to ensure that there was an effective ban on trade in goods and services with Ukraine. And the fact that it originated at a European level doesn't actually make a difference in terms of how it's implemented at a domestic level, even if it's initiated by us here domestically. The actual functional way in which it's implemented is much the same. So what legal obstacles did not exist that exist here is very hard to understand. And I do think, look, I made the point, new in the brief, and I hope that I hope that a change of course can happen, but it does seem to me that the government has been stuck between deciding to drop the bill or slow pedal it or water it down, and has decided to do all of the above to date, because it's very hard to justify, given the way it's been articulated already for so long, how it's taken so long to get to this point.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Deputies. Look, I don't think it's any secret that our colleagues in the US do not support this legislation. It's no secret that there are many states that have anti-boycott legislation, and they've been very clear how this would be enacted, and I don't think we should ignore that. At the same time, Ireland has always done what is the right thing.
We should be clear what it is.
We have always done what has been the right thing to do in recognising Palestine and encouraging other member states, and I'm really pleased to see that so many other member states have done that, in providing financial assistance and being some of the first member states to support the Africa case, and making sure that at every step of the way that we do the right thing, and we will consistently and continue to do the right thing. And I intend to write to my colleague, the High Representative, the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Council, in relation to humanitarian aid, because given the update that I received this week, I am not happy that we are not doing enough to ensure that more aid is getting into those who need it most. So there's more we can do, and we will continue to do, in making sure that those who need our help the most, that they get it immediately, and that our actions actually have an impact. And again, this is where, and again, the government has not been shy in saying this, where collective responses actually have a greater impact as well. So the work that we've been doing, working with European colleagues to make sure that there is very clearly an item on the agenda, on the table, which would remove preferential tariffs from Israel if they continue in the vein that they have. That is on the table, and it needs to remain on the table. And Ursula von der Leyen's comments most recently said that that is something that must remain on the table. In terms of the legislation, there are certain things that still need to be completed, and I can assure deputies, once that work is done, whether it's the legal advice from the Attorney General, whether it's the work that's been done looking at the overall regulatory impact assessment, whether it's the work that's been done assessing the huge body of work that was done by the committee, and I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge colleagues who put a huge amount of work in the pre-legislative scrutiny. Once all of that is done, and I have an opportunity as Minister to assess all of that together, we will be able to work collectively to bring forward legislation and making sure that our commitment overall to support Palestine, to support a two-state solution, but to bring about a lasting solution, that can be front and centre.
Thank you, Minister. We move on to question 3, Deputy O'Leary.
The scenes that we are seeing on our phones and on our televisions and in the media from Sudan is absolutely horrific. It is redolent of the kind of scenes that would have been seen in Rwanda 30 years ago. People being cut down in the street, people being slaughtered indiscriminately, and unfortunately it is seeming to escalate, and tens of thousands of people in Darfur unaccounted for. We don't know where they are, whether they've got out of Al-Fashir. So it's vitally important. I know we have debates on it further, but it's vitally important that we keep the focus on this particular issue, and I look forward to hearing the government's position.
Minister.
Ciara, can I thank the Deputy once again for raising this issue. I know Deputy Smith and Heenan have similar questions, and we will have a longer debate on this afternoon. Ciara, the conflict in Sudan has resulted in the world's most severe humanitarian and protection crisis, with more than 150,000 deaths, over 12 million people forcibly displaced, and more than 21 million people facing crisis levels of hunger. Following the appalling recent attacks against civilians by the Rapid Support Forces in Al-Fashir, violence continues to escalate in North Darfur and the Kordofan's Kordofans region. Large-scale ethnically motivated atrocities, including summary executions, civilian detentions and rape and starvation as weapons of war, unfortunately are widespread. The government has consistently highlighted the scale of the humanitarian crisis and the urgent need to act to ensure the protection of civilians, particularly women and girls, and safe passage for those fleeing. Also critical is the need to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access in line with international humanitarian law to reach those most in need. This year, Ireland has provided €14.3 million in humanitarian assistance to support people most in need in Sudan and those displaced in neighbouring countries. This assistance is channelled through trusted UN, Red Cross, Irish NGO and local partners to provide life-saving assistance. We are committed to further increasing our assistance in 2026. At EU level, Ireland has taken a leading role in initiating discussions on on Sudan, including on the establishment of the EU sanctions regime, and most recently in calling for the implementation of the October Council conclusions. The November EU Foreign Affairs Council, which Minister McEntee attended, adopted restrictive measures against a senior RSF commander. We are gravely concerned by reports that arms continue to reach parties to the conflict despite existing UN and EU embargoes and sanctions. Along with our EU and other partners, we have called on all external actors, directly or indirectly, supplying arms and funds to the parties to cease their support immediately. Ireland, with the EU, will continue to advocate for the expansion of the arms embargo to the whole territory of Sudan.
Deputy.
I welcome that statement, and I think it is maybe more robust than previous statements that have been made in relation to that latter part. I would say, in terms of the people of Sudan have suffered for a considerable period of time, and unfortunately their hopes of maybe a democratic settlement emerging a number of years ago has not been successful, and we now have this appalling conflict happening. I think it is important that all parties to the conflict, both the government forces and the RSF, see peace in the greatest extent possible. However, I would make the point, the government has made a good statement there in terms of the flow of weapons, but, I think it is fairly widely commented upon and believed that the government of the United Arab Emirates is one of the surrogates. The government seems to be reluctant to identify that. Has the Irish government raised directly with those governments who are, in my view, escalating the conflict or concerns in relation to the flow of arms?
Minister.
In relation to discussions, as I mentioned the government has raised this both at an EU and a UN level where appropriate, but I've also personally discussed it at a political level with senior officials and ministers from the UAE. That happened in relation to a meeting held here in Dublin a number of months ago, meetings held in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and indeed at high-level week of the UN General Assembly, and indeed I will be meeting the UAE ambassador in a couple of hours' time. Deputy, we have made it clear to all parties that we do not believe there should be any breaches on the arms embargo, and any allegations of that have been consistently denied by the UAE, as you would appreciate, Deputy. However, the UAE, alongside the United States, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, is a member of the Quad, a group formed with the aim of resolving the conflict, and we've encouraged all parties with influence to advocate for a peaceful resolution to the conflict and an end to the suffering of civilians. However, there also needs to be substantive political engagement and coordination between the EU, the African Union, the Quad and other international and national actors on de-escalation and mediation efforts.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy.
I appreciate that it is denied. Whether those denials are credible is maybe another question. I welcome that you are meeting them later on, and I think it's important that this issue is on the agenda. Unfortunately, it seems to me that the people of Sudan are to some extent pawns in a struggle for regional influence, and they're paying a very, very high price for it indeed. I suppose the other humanitarian element of it is the huge refugee crisis, and obviously the neighbouring countries, particularly Egypt, with some of the others as well, perhaps Chad and others. Significant amounts of refugees. I understand from what you've said previously that the Irish government will continue to support investment in ensuring that those refugees are supported, because it is the largest it's the largest movement of people in the world at the minute, and millions of people, literally millions of people, looking for refuge.
Minister.
And let there be no underestimation. This is the worst humanitarian crisis happening in the world at the moment, and it has been the worst for a considerable long time. It is the largest displacement of people, and Ireland will not be found wanting. As I mentioned, so far this year we have allocated €4.3 million in humanitarian assistance. That included an additional €3 million announced by myself and the Taoiseach in September at the UN, and we are committed to increasing that in 2026 as our needs. We also made sure that our payments to UN agency partners were actually brought forward this year due to the liquidity crisis, to make sure that refugees coming from this conflict and others weren't victims of any sort of liquidity crisis. I intend to visit Uganda, which is a home for a lot of refugees, particularly from South Sudan, in February of next year, and will continue to make sure that our support is known and felt.
Yeah. Okay, we move on to question 5. Deputy.
Gurmahagat, Kahirlach, Ara, Denim Cohortus Lat, or Duspara, or the Chapachan, Mar Ara Gnohi Achtuta, Agus Gonairo Lat, Gonairo Lat, the first Nua. Ara, my question today concerns the significant opportunity Ireland will have this coming year to help shape the CLAR or the agenda of the Council of the European Union. So can I ask you if you'll outline preparations currently underway in your department to meet the demands of Ireland's presidency of the European Union, and if you'll make a statement on the matter. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy, and thank you for the question. As you've outlined, Ireland will hold the EU presidency in the second half of 26. This is really an important opportunity. As the new Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, I'm really looking forward to engaging actively on our policy and on our operational preparedness, and that has already started my own engagement with officials in the department. I am determined that we will make the most of our presidency to shape the EU agenda. The priorities and the policy programme for our presidency will take into account, firstly, the EU's strategic agenda for 24 to 29 and the legislative work programme of the European Commission. They will also be shaped by our own priorities across an array of areas, including but not limited to the protection of the EU values at home and abroad, the enlargement of the European Union, European security and the competitiveness and simplification agenda, which covers a wide range of areas, everything from housing, delivery of infrastructure to agriculture and so many other areas. It's important to stress, however, that our policy programme will only be finalised and published shortly before the start of our presidency term in June 26. You'll appreciate that many things change, many issues come off the agenda, they're concluded, or indeed issues need to be further addressed, and we need to take that into account in setting out our final priorities. I recognise the importance in particular of ensuring that stakeholder groups also have their voices heard. We need to make sure that everybody in Ireland feels that they have an opportunity to have their say, but to be part of that overall discussion and that work. A series of consultation meetings with stakeholders from across business, civil society, trade unions and other interest groups has recently taken place. A call for written submissions on the development of Ireland's policy priorities hosted on gov.ie launched on the 5th of November, and this will run until the 12th of December. So I would encourage anybody who wants again to have their say that they take part in that online consultation. Work is also underway to prepare for more than 250 meetings that will be hosted in Ireland during the presidency. These will include a summit of the European political community, an informal meeting of the European Council and up to 22 informal ministerial meetings. The Government has made a firm commitment to resource and deliver a successful presidency, and I'm confident that in 26 Ireland will be able to make a significant and positive contribution in leading EU's agenda.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy.
Gurmahagat, Ara, it's clear that there's a lot of work already underway in terms of planning, and I really welcome that. I understand there'll be over 230 meetings in Ireland over what is actually a very short period of time, so it's going to be very intense, and we saw it before, I think it's 2013. But there is an opportunity for the country as we kind of take a leadership role in steering the EU agenda for that period of time and dealing with some of the challenges that confront us collectively across the EU bloc. You mentioned stakeholders at the Climate Committee yesterday. The question was raised as to how members in the Climate Committee could in some way help shape the agenda of those 6 months from a climate perspective, from an energy perspective and from an environmental perspective. I mean, an area like renewable energy, where the US has unfortunately turned its face, the current administration, the US has turned its face against it, but in the long term, European Union could take a leadership position in an area like that. So I'd welcome your thoughts, Minister, as to how, say, a committee, an Oireachtas committee or other groups could feed into that agenda. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. I suppose what I would say is that there is significant time still to be able to shape that agenda, because we won't have our final policy set out until June. We have 6 months now to make sure that we are very clear as to what we want in the agenda, and obviously that we are following on from items that are currently being discussed. There have been in-person meetings to date, so I know, for example, the Taoiseach would have met in quite a large meeting with IBEC, where you would have had representatives from climate and sustainability organisations, where also you have individual ministers, so the Minister for Climate himself is having meetings and discussions, and I've no doubt that each individual committee will be able to make either a submission or have face-to-face engagement with the relevant ministers to make sure that as we're developing our policy priorities, that in particular those who are elected representatives in this House, that your voice is heard very clearly on the agenda. But again, I would encourage those who perhaps aren't in this House to make sure that their voice is heard through the online submission process, and I will make sure that in my own work within my department, as we are coordinating obviously all of this, that as many opportunities as possible are made available to everyone to be able to actually shape the overall agenda, including when it comes to climate and sustainability.
Great. Thank you. We'd welcome that opportunity from the committee's perspective, and I'll pass that on to the committee. Can I just come back to the matter of the US of A for a minute? The US of A is a long-term, ally of Europe and of Ireland, and I would really ask that, irrespective of what administration is in place, the comings and goings of individual administrations in the US, that relationship is really important for Ireland and for Europe in the long term. So can I just ask that when it comes to formulation and engagement and leadership in that period of time, that Ireland would try and take a leadership role in making sure that relationships with the US as well are maintained and strengthened, so that we continue that relationship in a long term into the future, and that partnership between the US and Europe kind of flourishes once again. It is a little bit, the current administration has changed certain priorities, that's fair enough, democratically elected, but in the long term, that relationship needs to endure. So I'd appreciate your views on that. Thank you.
Minister.
Maybe at the outset, just to assure you, Deputy, and others, that we will always work extremely hard to maintain and to enhance and to grow what is a very strong and important relationship to us, and that is the Irish-US relationship. And obviously we see in that an opportunity to strengthen and grow the EU-US relationship as well. Only this week at the European Foreign Affairs Trade Council, actually, we had a visit from Ambassador Greer, but also Secretary Lutnick, where there was very warm discussions and engagement, despite the fact that obviously we've had, I would say, a challenging number of months in relation to our trade and the overall position that we find ourselves in now. But what's very clear from that engagement is that it is a lasting relationship, and that it is one of the most important relationships between the US and the EU. And within that, then obviously we see our own relationship with the US as being an absolutely vital support to that, and vital for us, not just in economic terms, but in cultural terms, and so many other ways as well. So whether it's through the US Trade Council, whether it's through our engagement on climate, whether it's through our engagement in cultural affairs or others, we will ensure that through the presidency and at every other stage, we are prioritising and working on that relationship, irrespective of who's in the overall administration.
Thank you, Minister. That brings priority questions to an end. We now move on to other questions. Question number 6, Deputy McCormick.
I would like to ask the Minister if she will provide an update on Ireland's current diplomatic priorities in light of recent international developments, with particular reference to Ireland's role in promoting peace, security and protection of human rights abroad, and if she will make a statement on it.
Minister.
May I thank Deputy McCormick for his timely question. Ireland's diplomatic priorities are set out in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Statement of Strategy for 2025 to 2028, which includes active diplomatic engagement in promoting peace, security and the protection of human rights abroad. We pursue these objectives against the backdrop of a changing geopolitical landscape and a wide range of challenges that require global solutions. In this context, the Government prioritises reinforcing the multilateral system and the international legal order, with the UN Charter at its heart. The Government also prioritises developing and maintaining strong and wide-ranging bilateral relations with key international partners. Our membership of the European Union, the world's longest and most successful peace project, is central to how we ensure our security, prosperity and well-being as a country. And as the Minister has just outlined to Deputy O'Murray, our preparations to hold the presidency of the Council of the European Union in the latter half of next year are well underway. Ireland is actively engaged in international efforts to bring an end to Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. The Government is committed to providing continued political, humanitarian, economic and non-lethal military support to Ukraine. Responding to conflict in the Middle East is also a priority. The Government consistently advocates at EU and UN level for the two-state solution and the equal right to self-determination, peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike, as well as full adherence to international law and international humanitarian law. Ireland continues to prioritise the promotion of human rights in a period where human rights norms are facing considerable pushback. Reflecting our commitment in this area, Ireland's campaign for the election to a seat on the Human Rights Council from 2077 to 2029 was launched last week in New York. Ireland prioritises engagement in support of a stable and secure international environment through conflict prevention, peacekeeping and peacebuilding, disarmament and non-proliferation, and promoting the resolution of disputes through multilateral diplomacy based on the principles of the UN Charter. The Government also makes sure that we have a full focus on food, foreign and security policy and common security and defence policy in a range of multilateral institutions including the UN, OSCE, OECD and the Council of Europe.
Deputy.
Minister, you mentioned Ireland's commitment to peace and human rights. Given that negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are now underway, can Ireland use a strong reputation for principled diplomacy to support these efforts? Specifically, do you see a role for Ireland within the EU, the UN or the OSCE in helping to reinforce the conditions for a credible, just and durable peace, including humanitarian protections and respect for international law?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Deputy. There's a couple of elements to that one. The negotiations that are underway in Geneva are extremely welcome between the US and the Ukraine, but Ireland isn't a direct party to it. And one thing that came up at the Foreign Affairs Council, which I attended yesterday virtually, was the need for there to be an EU track to the negotiations. And whilst there are 3 European countries around the negotiations, we want to make sure that there's a real EU voice. And within that EU voice will be Ireland's voice. And Ireland is very clear that we want a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, but a peace that is based on international law and respecting the territorial sovereignty of the people of Ukraine. To be quite blunt, Deputy, there can be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Equally, there can be nothing about Europe without Europe. Ireland will, of course, as we have continuously done so at a UN level, continue to push the need to respect international law. And indeed, there are a number of cases before various international courts that Ireland will be a party to, highlighting concerns in relation to human rights abuses and, as the Minister already alluded to, in relation to the forced abduction of children from Ukraine too.
Deputy.
Minister, Ireland's own peace process culminating in the Good Friday Agreement was built on dialogue, patience, international support and the difficult work of building trust between communities. With negotiations now taking place between Russia and Ukraine, does your department see scope for Ireland to share the lessons we learned from our experience in areas like mediation, inclusive dialogue, confidence building and reconciliation? And is the Government prepared to offer that expertise through purely civilian and diplomatic channels to international partners supporting this peace process?
Minister.
Absolutely, Deputy. When there is a ceasefire and when there is a peace agreement in Ukraine, Ireland is fully prepared to play a real part in that. Just 2 weeks ago, I was actually in Colombia, which is one of 13 Irish aid countries, and our work there, our programme work, is solely in relation to peace. The experience of Ireland has been put in place to uphold the 2016 peace agreement. I visited projects with decommissioned FARC guerrillas who were being supported by the Irish government to turn their back on violence and engage on peace and lead far better lives. This is the sort of thing that we can offer to the world, Deputy, and people regularly refer to this in this chamber with regard to the situation in the Middle East, and that's true too, and there's a lot of particularly Irish NGOs working in places like Ramallah in this area, but I think Ukraine offers us a great opportunity. But first and foremost, let there be no equivocation, our support is for the people of Ukraine, to make sure that real peace comes to Ukraine, and the way that real peace comes to Ukraine is for an absolute ceasefire from the Russian invasion as soon as possible.
Question 7, Deputy Quaid.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Can I ask the Minister whether she or her immediate predecessor or anyone in her department has engaged with the UK authorities regarding the Palestine Action Group, which was proscribed as a terrorist organisation by the UK government in July? The group was blacklisted for instigating a number of direct action protests against weapons manufacturers involved in selling arms to Israel in the context of their campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza against the civilian population there since October 2023.
Minister.
Thanks, Deputy. To say at the outset, Ireland maintains regular and constructive dialogue with UK authorities at all levels on a wide range of matters. I have in the last week engaged with my UK counterpart since taking up office, and I look forward to meeting with the UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper shortly to take forward our cooperation on a range of foreign policy issues. An important area of engagement between the UK and Ireland is on the Middle East policy, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I particularly welcome the British government's decision in September to formally recognise the state of Palestine and their active engagement on the 20-point peace plan to end the conflict in Gaza, which was endorsed by the UN Security Council on the 17th of November, which again is very welcome. I welcome the ceasefire, the hostage release deal in Gaza as an important step on the road to peace. Our focus is now on preserving the ceasefire and ensuring that humanitarian aid flows into and throughout Gaza. Ireland has been clear that all parties must adhere to their commitments in full, desist from any actions inconsistent in what has been agreed, and continue to negotiate in good faith to ensure full implementation. In respect of the British government's decision to designate Palestinian Action as a terrorist organisation under its Terrorism Act, I understand that this decision is subject to a judicial review and is currently before the High Court in London, so you'll appreciate, Deputy, it's not something that I can comment on live cases before the British courts in the same way I wouldn't comment on something that is before the Irish courts. More broadly, though, I do want to say the government remains committed to upholding human rights, including those pertaining to freedom of expression, the right to peaceful protest, both domestically and internationally. These fundamental rights are enshrined in international human rights instrument to which both Ireland and the United Kingdom are signatories. These are issues that would regularly be discussed as part of overall political dialogue between Ireland and all of its partners, including the UK. My department will continue to monitor developments in this area, including in respect of any cases involving Irish citizens. The provision of consular assistance to Irish citizens is an important element of the work of my department. Consular assistance is provided in a strictly confidential manner, and as with all cases, we wouldn't comment on individual cases directly, but again, I'm here to support any
Deputy.
Irish citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The UK government has, in an Orwellian inversion of truth, conflated protest against genocide with terrorism through its prescription of Palestine Action, placing them absurdly on the same blacklist as organisations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Since the Palestine Action Group has been designated a terrorist organisation, at least 2,300 people have been arrested, according to the group Defend Our Juries, and a large proportion of these arrests took place at peaceful sitting protests in public areas across August and September of this year. And those arrested have included young students, teachers, pensioners, even an 83-year-old vicar. The United Nations Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, said that the UK government's designation is, quote, disturbing. He said it's disproportionate and unnecessary. While the Council of Europe, Europe's human rights watchdog, criticised the, quote, excessive limits it places on the right to protest. Does the Minister plan to raise the protection of the right to protest when she next engages with her UK counterparts?
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. Again, as I said, as this is before the courts, I won't specifically reference what you've outlined, but what I would restate and emphasise is Ireland's absolute support and commitment to a person's right to protest and to peacefully protest. I think that's extremely important. We also place a very strong emphasis on making sure that any Irish citizen who's abroad, who finds themselves in difficulty, whether relating to something like this or otherwise, that they would have consular assistance Again, I would re-stress that point. If there is anybody who needs that assistance, that is there and available to them. Of course, in my engagement with, whether it's Yvette Cooper or anybody else in the UK government, this is an area that Ireland is very clear and very strong on. Individuals have a right to peaceful protest on matters that are concerning to them. Obviously, where that crosses a line, where there is violence or where there is use of force, then we move into a different space. But we must uphold every individual's international right to peaceful protest, and that's certainly something that I can and will raise with my counterpart when I meet with her, hopefully, in the weeks ahead.
Deputy.
Thank you, Minister. The acclaimed and best-selling Irish author Sally Rooney was unable to collect her Sky Arts Award for Literature in person earlier this year, as she did not feel safe entering the UK due to the risk of arrest for her public support of Palestine Action. She has even had to cancel all future public engagements in the UK and has expressed concerns that because of her intention to support Palestine Action financially, that the availability of her books there could be affected. So one of the leading Irish authors of our time does not now feel that she can enter the UK because of her support for a group that is peacefully protesting genocide. This is just one example of how the UK's designation of Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation begins to seep into every corner of society. of how it can constrain the right of Irish citizens as well as British citizens to speak the truth at this darkest time in our history. Can I ask the Minister what meaningful engagement specifically she plans to have with her UK counterpart about their treatment and prosecution of members of Palestine Action, and if she will push for the UK government to end its designation of the group as a terrorist organisation?
Thank you. Minister.
Thanks, Deputy. Again, as something is before the courts, it's not an issue that I can raise or that I'll discuss here today. What I can say, and what I will say certainly to my colleague when we meet, is the absolute necessity to uphold an individual's right to peaceful protest. This is something that we cherish here in this country, but more broadly in terms of our support for Palestine, I think there has been unanimous support for the need to reach a ceasefire, and I do very much welcome the ceasefire that has been reached, albeit a very fragile and very difficult ceasefire. I very much welcome the fact that hostages have been released. I very much welcome the fact that humanitarian aid has started to flow into Gaza, albeit again not at the level that it needs to be, and we need to make sure that every single one of our actions now, that cements and upholds the ceasefire that is currently underway. And I know, and I have no doubt, that citizens in Ireland will continue to raise their voice and to make sure that their concerns are heard, and that we collectively continue to do everything that we can to ensure that that ceasefire holds. But certainly any citizens of Ireland in the UK or anywhere else that need consular assistance, that is there and available to them, and we need to make sure that as a country we are reiterating and stressing every individual's human right to peaceful protest, and that's something that I'll certainly do with my colleagues.
Move on to question 8, Deputy O'Farrell.
Thank you, Chairman. As I rise, I want to avail of the opportunity to congratulate Minister McEntee on her appointment. Foreign Affairs is always a very important brief, but at this time of international geopolitical flux or chaos, it's a particularly important role to play, and working with Minister Richmond, I'm sure you'll do a very fine job for us on the international stage. My question relates to the situation in Afghanistan and whether you have yet had or will in the future undertake engagement with your counterparts on the situation there.
Minister.
I'm very grateful to the Oireachtas Quarter for raising for this important issue. Afghanistan was not discussed at the meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council which Minister McEntee attended on 20th November. However, both Minister McEntee and myself believe that the current dire human rights and humanitarian situation in Afghanistan clearly warrants a political level discussion within the Foreign Affairs Council, given that the last such discussion took place in March 2023. Ireland will continue to advocate for this within the relevant council bodies. We will also continue to fully support the role of the EU through its Special Envoy for Afghanistan in working to address the human rights and humanitarian situation within Afghanistan, including through the UN-led Doha process. The EU Special Envoy has recently briefed our Ambassador to the EU Peace and Security Committee on the current situation. In line with the commitment in securing Ireland's future, we will continue to play an active role in seeking to maintain EU and international attention on the appalling human rights situation in Afghanistan, and in particular the unacceptable restrictions imposed by the Taliban on Afghan women and girls. Along with other EU partners, Ireland played a lead role in pressing for the establishment of an independent investigative mechanism in Afghanistan at the most recent session of the UN Human Rights Council. This represents a significant milestone in the pursuit of truth, justice and accountability for the people of Afghanistan. The Department of Foreign Affairs also continues to support the Afghan people through the provision of urgent humanitarian assistance, which is principally channelled through the UN, its agencies and trusted international partner organisations. Since January of 2020, Ireland has provided over €20 million in humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan through the Irish Aid Programme, including almost €5 million in humanitarian funding this year to respond to needs in Afghanistan and amongst Afghan refugees in the region, including the specific needs of women and girls.
Thank you for that response, Minister. I'm sure we all remember some years ago when America withdrew from Afghanistan, when the Taliban began to march on Kabul, when Ashraf Ghani ran away and left his people to the fate that awaited them under the Taliban. Many of us hoped that there might be a more moderate regime than had been feared, but it's quite clear from the most recent report from Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur that the situation in Afghanistan continues to deteriorate. So one of the reasons for my question is that I note that the two most recent statements from the Council of Ministers came in August 2023 and in September 2024. So while I know it's inordinately difficult given the number of conflicts there are in the world at present, we can't let the real tragedy that is happening in Afghanistan become a forgotten tragedy, so it needs to be continuously kept on the agenda.
Minister.
Kerlik, and I fundamentally agree with the Deputy, and although I don't know if the term moderate and Taliban can ever be used in the same sentence, I understand the point he was trying to make, and I do absolutely agree that the attention absolutely needs to be continued, and that's one of the main reasons why there is a specific reference in the programme for government to protecting women and girls in Afghanistan, because we believe we have a responsibility to make sure that Ireland, as a country who has an invested interest in the future of this country, continue to state that. I will absolutely undertake, along with Minister McEntee, to see if we can get this on the agenda of the next Foreign Affairs Council meeting, even as a sub-item for discussion. And indeed, we can continue to look at other fora for ways that we can raise this, most particularly through our current campaign for election to the UN Human Rights Council that sits from 2027 to 2029.
Thank you very much for that response. It's particularly positive. I'm very proud of my own local community in Kildare, where people came together to welcome two Afghani families into the local community. They've settled in very, very well, but they continue to fear what is happening in their home country, and we hear from them of the disasters that are taking place for women and for girls, their exclusion from society, their relegation to a form of subhuman living. We're also conscious, I think, of the situation developing between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and how the Pakistani Taliban is becoming ever more active, and the loss of life that is happening in the conflict between those two countries. So I think we should also acknowledge here the number of individuals and schools and agencies in the country that are trying remotely to provide educational services to women and girls in Afghanistan, and we should use whatever resources we have to assist them in that.
Minister.
One of the things that was often being lost in the public mindset or in the discussion is that level of compassion, and perhaps eclipsed understandably by the sheer scale of compassion needed after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that led to over 110,000 people coming here. But before that, after the fall of Kabul and the return of the Taliban, that level of real community-driven compassion, and I know the cases that you reference in Kildare. I think of my own sister, and indeed my own parliamentary sister assistant, both ironically called Emma, who were very involved in the campaign to bring the Afghani women's hockey team, and we were able to get the entire Afghani women's hockey team out of Afghanistan because women playing sport is a crime under the Taliban. Now that's just a particular reference. Ireland obviously now has a new embassy in Pakistan, and we continue to use our resident ambassador to make sure that we advocate for peace in that region and make sure that Ireland's voice at a community level is heard on the international level too.
Thank you. Okay, question 9, Deputy Ward can't be here. Question 10, Deputy Muraku, no. So we move on to question number 11, and that's been taken again by Deputy O'Free. So question 11, Minister.
I simply want to ask the Minister her views and those of her EU counterparts in relation to the post-ceasefire attacks in Gaza.
Thank you, Deputy. Achieving a just and lasting settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been a priority for this government, with Ireland's foreign policy on this issue very clear and consistent and grounded in the commitment to upholding international law. The agreement on a ceasefire and indeed the hostage deal represents very welcome progress. It has brought desperately needed respite to Palestinians in Gaza and relief to the people of Israel, albeit I think we all know that it is a very fragile ceasefire and something that needs to be worked on. I commend the efforts of the US as well as Qatar, Turkey and Egypt in securing this much needed agreement. I also commend efforts to progress implementation of what has been agreed. The international community, Ireland included, must play its part if these efforts are to be succeeded. In this context, the adoption of a resolution on Gaza by the UN Security Council, which is the first in many years, is a further step towards implementation of the peace plan. The ceasefire is nevertheless fragile, as I've mentioned, and must be preserved. All parties must adhere to their commitments in full, and it is clear that that is not happening given the fact that many innocent civilians have been killed even in recent days. All parties must desist from any actions inconsistent with what's been agreed, continue to negotiate in good faith to ensure full implementation. Our current focus is on supporting efforts to build up this fragile ceasefire, and we call on all parties to work to ensure that peace efforts are successful and to refrain from further violence. The primary focus at EU level right now is ensuring the success of the ceasefire, the peace deal, and making contributions to international efforts. We also must urgently address the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza, and I mentioned this before. We had an update at the Council earlier last week where we were updated and told that over 40,000 young children are still at risk of starvation. So while there is a significant increase in the number of humanitarian trucks allowing aid to flow into Gaza, it is nowhere near enough. And again, I would reiterate that I intend to write to the High Representative to see what further political pressure Europe, all of our counterparts, can put on Israel to make sure that they are lifting what is a significant blockade on some of the aid that is due to get in. These were among some of the issues discussed at the most recent Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels just last Monday.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy.
I suppose one couldn't but be quite surprised at what has happened. We welcome the ceasefire, although it's a ceasefire of sorts that has happened in Gaza, but we are aware of the fact that slaughter of the innocent still continue and that we don't in truth have a full and total ceasefire. Gaza's health ministry reported that more than 300 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli fire and nearly 900 injured since the ceasefire agreement came into effect on the 10th of October. So the situation needs to be continuously monitored. I mentioned surprise that the Trump involvement achieved a welcome progress in this particular matter. Progress where the architecture, the international architecture that we have put in place to deal with conflicts had failed and failed abysmally. But instead we see the Trump regime, with all its weaknesses and peculiarities, achieving something in Gaza.
Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. You're right to highlight the fact that the ceasefire at the moment has very clearly been breached in some instances, but we also need to make sure that our focus does not get averted from what is happening in the West Bank either, and this is something that I raised with colleagues last week. The number of people who have been killed in the West Bank in the last 2 years alone is almost as many as those who have been killed in the last 20 years. So there has been an escalation of violence within the West Bank, and so we need to consistently call this out and do everything in our power to make sure that this can be responded to and responded to adequately. And again, the suspension of preferential tariffs, the associated agreement, the fact that this is still on the table is because Ireland and other member states have pushed for that to be the case. We cannot allow either side or party to the peace agreement to breach that in the way that they are consistently, and so we need to make sure that there are levers still available to us to respond to these changes. And of course, from our perspective, we will continue to provide aid that is very much needed, not just in terms of humanitarian aid and the trucks that are flowing in, but also other financing that's now going to be needed to actually rebuild Gaza and make sure that we can focus on that and that that is a priority when we talk about a ceasefire and a lasting peace.
Yeah, I mean, that question of aid is of vital importance, and we cannot ignore the fact, for example, that the Israelis have not agreed to open yet the Rafah crossing, and that the aid is accessing the Palestinian people via a variety of much smaller crossing and entry points. Minister, I suppose the Irish people would like to know, can we be confident that the aid that we're providing is getting to the people of Gaza? Irish people have been very generous in respect of their support of the people there, and I think they would want to be confident that the aid is reaching those who so desperately need it. And in terms of the pursuit of a long-term solution to this particular problem, it's obvious that the war, that the murder and mayhem has claimed the attention of all entities dealing with this, but how far are we from sitting down internationally to begin to engage on a long-term solution to the problem?
Sorry, Minister, I think Deputy Brendan, do you want in the supplementary?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Minister, I spoke previously about I actually flew out to Egypt and I met people on the ground, and I've kept in touch with these people, and I've been in touch with these people over the last couple of weeks and very, very concerned on this word ceasefire, because that's not the feel on the ground. I have two huge concerns. Number one is the level of aid getting through, and how also our rebuilding process. What is the plan to rebuild? But there's you have to call it rebuilding of the people, of the young people that have gone through this horrific war. Like in the last 4 years, like the build, it's before October. These kids have grown up with the sound of bombs in their ears. And I feel that if we don't do something about the rebuilding of the young people, we're going to have a major, major issue around the world. They will be angry young men and women, and they'll be unleashed to the world unless they get help.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. The immediate challenge is that there are tens of thousands of children that will starve to death if we don't increase the number of aid trucks that are flowing through. It is important to say that Irish aid trucks are getting through, and our own officials have been on the ground and have been able to verify that, whether it's tents, food or medicine that's been provided, but we need substantially more. There are blockages being put in the way by Israel, and we need that to change, and I will do everything that I can in using my voice and working with colleagues to ensure that that aid increases. In terms of the rebuilding of Gaza, in our visit and my meeting last week, we also had a meeting, the first meeting with the Palestinian Authority and the Prime Minister and members of the Palestinian Authority who attended, with members from the Middle East and Europe and beyond, where Ireland and I specifically raised the fact that €3 billion in tax revenues are being withheld by Israel that should be going directly to Palestine, which would significantly help with the rebuilding, with the investment in hospitals that's so badly needed, and support for schools and young people. So we will consistently, and I will continue to raise this issue and many more issues, but we will also continue to ensure that aid is provided. Once the ceasefire agreement was reached, €6 million was committed by this government directly to provide aid for Palestinian people, and that aid is getting through, albeit again not at the rate we want it to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to question number 12, Deputy Farrell again.
Okay, here we want to return to the question of Ukraine, and to ask the Minister if she agrees that there can be no peace agreement imposed on Ukraine without its support and support of the European Union generally.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. I'll start with the quote as my Deputy has. There can be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And that's something that has consistently been said at a European level. At this critical juncture for Ukraine, almost 4 years of a brutal Russian aggression, I want to again emphasise Ireland's unequivocal support and solidarity with Ukraine. I welcome the ongoing efforts of President Trump in the United States to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and achieving that just and lasting peace and security for Ukraine, but also for the wider European region. It's more important than ever that Europe and the United States continue to work together to achieve this, and this can only happen as well with the support of Europe as well as the US. The emerging US proposals, as well as plans for further negotiations, represent a very welcome step forward. I welcome the progress made at Sunday's meeting between the US and Ukraine in Geneva. I welcome the fact that EU institutions and EU member states were also present. We look forward to these talks continuing in a positive manner and to further progress being achieved. Ukraine is engaging positively, and I think we can see that from the commentary and from President Zelensky himself. They're engaging constructively in these discussions despite the ongoing military assault on its towns, cities, ports and critical energy infrastructure. I said this earlier, I do not believe the actions of Russia are the actions of a country that wants peace. However, we have to work towards that sole objective and goal. A massive attack on Sunday in Kharkiv resulted in the loss of more innocent lives. This follows an appalling attack in Ternopil that killed 34 people, including 6 children, only in recent weeks as well. It is crucial that any agreement upholds Ukraine's sovereignty. It upholds their independence based on respect for the principles of the UN Charter, the fundamental principle that borders cannot be changed by force. This must be upheld. Any agreement must also protect Ukraine and Europe's vital security. That means strong, credible guarantees that ensure Ukraine can defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity to avoid a repetition of the past. This is not just vital for Ukraine, it's vital for the European Union, for Member States, including Ireland. I think it's welcome, can I just say, that assurances have been given that the EU will be involved in discussions on any issue that directly relates to it, such as enlargement and immobilised assets as well.
Deputy.
Not sure I can agree with you, Minister, in welcoming the nature of the American involvement in this particular situation. I mean, it's been characterised by being on Putin's side, appearing to be on Ukraine's side, now being back on the Putin side again. Indeed, some people would think that the current peace plan was written in Russian and translated via Google Translate. I would be deeply concerned about many of the provisions in that plan, which seems to have the enthusiastic support of President Trump. One could believe, and given recent statements, that Secretary Rubio is perhaps more realistic in his approach and is trying to inject a level of realism into the debate. But the bottom line is Europe must be involved so as to ensure that, as you say, Minister, quite rightly, nothing is done about Ukraine without Ukraine's full involvement and without Ukraine being able to benefit at the end of the day.
I do think we have to acknowledge that there are very clear efforts on the part of the US to try and bring about a ceasefire, while at the same time acknowledging in the 28-point plan that we saw put forward, there are very clearly elements of that need further work on. Again, you cannot have a situation where land is ceded by force. Simply cannot be the basis for any type of a ceasefire. You cannot have a situation where a country cannot in the future be able to defend itself should something like this happen again. You cannot have a situation where Europe is committed to certain things without Europe being around the table. And so it's really important that the conversations, the negotiations and the discussions that are happening now, that Europe's voice is part of those discussions and that Ukraine agrees to whatever is put forward. I would stress again or say that there is a recommendation or a proposal of an unconditional ceasefire that has been on the table since March, and Ukraine has been very clear that it will sign up to that. It would ensure that all lines as they currently stand would be frozen, that people would come around the table, and that negotiations on many of the matters that we've seen in the 28-point plan, that could be discussed at that stage, and I would encourage that would be something still on the table. But
Thank you,
again,
Minister.
I think we need to make sure that we support any discussions and negotiations, but that our absolute commitment and priority is that Ukraine is supported and that they are agreeing with whatever is around the table on the proposals.
Deputy.
Okay, we all want peace, but what is certain is that Russia can't be rewarded for its crimes. It shouldn't be readmitted to the G8 or reintegrated into the global economy. Now, the plan, for example, demands Ukrainian denazification, effectively validating Russia's absurd narrative that Ukraine is riddled with Nazis. I've been there, as have other members of this House. Don't think there's any evidence available to that end. The war crimes that have been committed in Bucha, Irpin and other places, the forced relocations to Russia of children, repeated strikes on apartment buildings, most recently in the western city of Ternopil, the torture and abuse and execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. And despite all of this, the plan as it currently stands grants the Kremlin full immunity from prosecution. Does the Minister agree that whatever agreement might be reached, that there can be no normalisation of EU relations with Russia while the monster Putin is president?
Thank you. Minister.
Jeff.
Sorry, did you want in? Right. Sorry, Minister.
I welcome the government providing over 100 million in non-lethal military support to Ukraine. I welcome 116,000 Ukrainians under temporary protective directive, with some 80,000 estimating to stay. But I have huge concern over the actual peace process itself and the role Europe had played in this, because the 28-point plan was made up without the involvement of Ukraine. And that is so wrong. And just on the final point, could you give us an update in relation to President Zelensky's outstanding invitation to Ireland?
Minister.
Again, I would stress that there are very clearly elements of the plan that was put forward that are not realistic, that are not credible, and that won't be accepted by Ukraine and certainly won't be accepted by the EU. But we must use this as a framework and as a basis for discussions which to date haven't taken place. It's very clear that this is an illegal war. It's very clear that Vladimir Putin is responsible for war crimes. It's very clear that they are continuing as we speak, and so we need to make sure that Ireland's voice is strong, but that we continue to put pressure on Russia. So in our conversations last week in the Foreign Affairs Council, the 19th sanction package is currently underway, but there is a proposal and a suggestion on a 20th package of sanctions. How do we make sure that we impose as much pressure on Russia to try and bring it to the table so that any negotiations around a peace process and a ceasefire, that they are fair and balanced, and that Russia does feel pressure, because I think to date, for a lot of this ongoing war, Russia has not felt the pressure that it needs to. So in Europe, we need to do everything that we can through sanctions, through diplomatic channels, but also in our work with the US to make sure that we can bring about a lasting peace. Because again, this is not just about Ukraine, albeit they are front and centre. This is already starting to seep into the security of European member states, and we need to make sure that it does not go any further. Thank you.
Okay. With the agreement of the House, I will go back to question 10. Deputy O'Muircheartaigh.
Gurmaiga Cahirlock. Minister, if you could provide an update on any engagement at EU level on the EU-Israel agreement. Look, we all know the humanitarian conditions that unfortunately have never been employed. We know what Israel has done. We know that maximum pressure and leverage needs to be carried out. We know that's probably the only reason we are in, if you can call this a peace plan at this point in time. And then if I can also ask for an update, and I understand you did speak about it earlier in relation to the Israeli settlements prohibition of importation of goods bill, but again, it's not much good unless we actually do the job properly, that it happens quickly with services as well.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy, and thank you for the question. On the 14th of February 24, the then Taoiseach, along with Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain, wrote to the President of the European Commission requesting an urgent review of whether Israel was complying with its humanitarian rights obligations under the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Furthermore, the letter requested that the Commission propose appropriate measures for the consideration of the Council should it find that Israel was in breach of its obligations. A review of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, initiated by the Foreign Affairs Council in May of 2025, found that actions taken by the Israeli government represented a breach of international elements, or of essential elements, relating to respect for human rights and democratic principles. The European Commission subsequently put forward a number of proposals, one of which was to suspend the core trade-related provisions of the associated agreement. Ireland has welcomed the Commission proposals and encouraged other Member States to support them, notwithstanding the positive and welcome recent developments with regard to a ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza. Ireland, along with other Member States, has made clear our view that the proposals should remain on the table. In her State of the Union address, the President of the European Commission was clear on the rationale for tabling the package, which remains valid and was valid as we discussed last week. The Government has always been of the view that the EU-Israeli Association Agreement must be interpreted and applied in accordance with the obligations of the EU and its Member States under international law. In June, the Government approved the general scheme of the Israeli settlements and the occupied Palestinian territory Prohibition of Importation of Goods Bill. The main purpose of the bill is to prohibit the importation of goods into the state from Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. It remains the Government's preference that collective action would be taken at EU level, and we continue to pursue this. At EU level, the primary objective right now is ensuring the success of what is a very fragile ceasefire and peace deal. In addition, the Taoiseach, in his capacity as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, wrote to the High Rep Callas in advance of the June Foreign Affairs Council to ask how the Commission assesses the impact of the EU-Israeli Association Agreement of the ICJ Advisory Opinion of July 24. The High Rep responded to his letter on the 17th of October, indicating the Commission's view that the EU's current approach is in line with the spirit and letter of the advisory opinion. Our assessment is different, and so we're currently studying the detail of that response provided by the High Representative and considering our next steps. Thank you.
Look, Minister, straight away, the EU-Israel Association Agreement, we can all see that there were particular issues in relation to it, not only in the sense of the particular deal that was really sweet from the Israeli point of view, And like, we talk of these humanitarian conditions, but obviously there was absolutely no power in relation to enforcement, and unfortunately there was a lack of will across the European Union. Look, I welcome that ourselves and others have pushed in relation to this. I don't think it's an issue we can let slide, and while we have a peace plan, it's a peace plan in which Palestinians will suffer. We have seen that the Israeli regime is absolutely destined on its best day of ensuring there is no two-state solution. So as much as we need to push the EU, we also then have to do the piece of work that we can do ourselves. And even though it is not everything, if we could publish the AG's advice so we could end that particular argument. We really need to see the Occupied Territories Bill enforced in full, and that because as much as it mightn't have the impact that people talk about, this won't have an absolute spectacular impact, but it's part of what Spain are doing, what Slovenia are doing, and it is similar to what happened with South Africa. The Dunn Stores workers, I doubt that what their action had a real financial impact, but it was part of something wider, and it made a huge difference long term, and we need to be part of doing this.
Thank you. Minister.
And I do acknowledge that other colleagues have made progress in terms of implementing legislation. Some of it didn't have to happen in the same way that we have to progress our legislation, but I would also stress as well that it happened prior to the ceasefire. I think what's really important and what our focus and our priority needs to be, not just at home but at an EU level and internationally, is making sure that that ceasefire holds. It's very clear that there are breaches that are happening and occurring. It's very clear that there's more humanitarian aid that needs to be let through, and that is why it is absolutely essential that the EU-Israel Association Agreement, that the proposal that has been put on the table that would remove those preferential tariffs, that remains on the table. And Ireland is the country that pushed for and that started and initiated that process. And I again reiterated the need for that to remain on the table at the most recent Council meeting. And I won't lie, there were other Member States or there were other individuals perhaps who think that we should take it off the table, that it would allow for further progress to be made. But while there continues to be persistent breaches of the ceasefire by Israel, we need to make sure that every lever available to us is very firmly on the table. In terms of the legislation, again, given a very clear commitment that we will uphold our programme for government commitment, that we will progress the legislation, but there is further information and advice that I'm waiting on, and once I have that, we'll be able to make further progress.
Deputy.
Thank you. Not only do we need maintenance of the ceasefire, not only do we need to make sure that there are no breaches, we have to maintain whatever leverage we can and the wider international community can on Israel. At this moment in time, we are somewhat glad that it is not engaged in genocidal action, but let's be absolutely clear, it is determined, at least the regime at this point in time, is absolutely determined in delivering, in making sure that nobody can deliver justice, freedom, self-determination for the Palestinian people, a two-state solution. And the fact is, this is one of the few things we can do. We need to make sure we maintain whatever pressure. The EU-Israel Association Agreement is a blemish, is a further disgrace in relation to how the European Union has dealt with this whole genocidal nightmare for the Palestinians, but also we need to move on the Occupied Territories Bill. It is the one thing that we can do. We need to end this argument in relation to legals. And as I say, it is about the fact that we are doing this alongside others. This will have an impact. The reason there is a peace plan is because, obviously, even for Donald Trump, he did not like the idea of what the Israelis were doing and the killing of children and innocent people.
Minister.
I think we need to acknowledge and look to the fact that the peace plan, albeit there's a lot of work still needs to be done, made reference to a pathway for a two-state solution. It's something that Ireland has consistently called for and supports, that many other Member States are now supporting, and it's something that we need to work towards in making sure that we have a pathway towards a two-state solution. But first and foremost, our priority needs to be on ensuring that the ceasefire, that is extremely fragile, that it can hold, that the thousands of malnourished and starving children and citizens more broadly that need aid, that they get access to that aid, and that we ensure that the Palestinian Authority, that what they need to rebuild Gaza, that can be provided to them. And again, the meeting that we had only recently, a first meeting of the authority with member states as well as countries from the Middle East and beyond, I restated Ireland's call for Israel to release over €3 billion of funds that they are withholding in taxes. That would go a long way towards helping to start rebuilding, whether it's investment in our hospitals, schools, whether it's shelter for those who need it most, particularly coming into what's going to be a cold
Thank you, Minister.
period as well.
Question 13, 35 and 97 is grouped. And Deputy Smith is in the House, so Deputy, you can lead.
Thank you, Chair. Look, very thankful that we're having statements on Sudan this afternoon, and this question was submitted in advance of us knowing that. But I'm just looking for any update or information you can provide the House in terms of what we are doing as a state in humanitarian terms to help alleviate or tackle, understand better, or deal with the genocide, the travesty and the violence that's taking place in Sudan.
Minister.
I'd like to thank Deputy Smith, as I did thank Deputy O'Leary, for raising this matter consistently, and indeed I think it's going to be a very important debate this afternoon. Deputy, the Government remains deeply concerned by the devastating conflict in Sudan, which has led to the world's worst humanitarian and protection crisis. More than 150,000 people have already been killed, some 12 million people are forcibly displaced, and over 21 million people face crisis levels of hunger, including famine. This is a man-made famine. I am appalled by the targeting of civilians by all parties to the conflict. I condemn the atrocities in Al Fasher by the RSF and the escalating violence in North Darfur. Large-scale ethnically motivated atrocities, including summary executions, sexual and gender-based violence and the detention of civilians, are part of a widespread pattern, including the use of rape and starvation as weapons of war. These actions are unconscionable and must stop. There must be accountability and justice for such atrocities. Ireland, together with Germany, UK, the Netherlands and Norway, succeeded in ensuring the adoption of a resolution on the situation in Al Fasher at a special session of the Human Rights Council on the 14th of November. The resolution requests the independent international fact-finding mission for Sudan to conduct an urgent inquiry into the violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law committed in and around Al Fasher. The environment of impunity in Sudan simply must end. Ireland has taken a leading role within the EU on the establishment of the EU sanctions regime. The EU Foreign Affairs Council in October adopted Council conclusions strongly condemning the ongoing conflict. Ireland successfully called for Sudan to be placed on the agenda at this month's EU Foreign Affairs Council, which adopted restrictive measures against the senior RSF commander. The international community needs to exert greater pressure on the parties to return to the negotiating table and to engage in dialogue. I welcome the ongoing work of the Quad, including efforts to negotiate a 3-month humanitarian truce. It is vital that there is substantive political engagement and coordination between the European Union, African Union, Quad and other international and national actors on de-escalation and mediation efforts. We will continue to work internationally with our EU and other partners to call on all parties to adhere to their obligations to protect civilians and aid workers and to ensure immediate, unconditional and unhindered humanitarian access in full compliance with international humanitarian law. In June, I signed a joint statement by 30 donor countries condemning attacks against civilians and humanitarian workers. I also joined an Australian-led declaration for the protection of humanitarian workers at the UN General Assembly in New York in September. Ireland has provided €14.3 million in humanitarian assistance so far in 2025 to support people most in need in Sudan and those displaced in neighbouring countries. This assistance is channelled through trusted UN, Red Cross, Irish NGO and local partners to provide life-saving aid. We are committed to further increasing our assistance in 2026. Ultimately, an agreement on a cessation of hostilities must be reached in order to end the suffering of the Sudanese people. This must be followed by a negotiated, permanent, peaceful and civilian-led political settlement that respects the territorial integrity of Sudan.
Deputy.
The Minister for his response, and it's clear to me that Ireland is taking this very, very seriously and is acting in our capacity as much as we can to support what is a very complex situation. I read one article that said the history of war in Sudan has both a long and a short. There's both a long history and a short history, and both are very, very complicated. The numbers that the Minister articulated in his response there are absolutely astronomical. The velocity of violence that's taking place there is almost beyond comprehension. We spent the last hour and a half here talking, amongst other things, the illegal war in Ukraine and the ongoing tragedy and crisis in Palestine and Gaza, which are not insignificant by any means. But we need to do everything we can with our partners in the EU and in the United Nations to ensure that Sudan gets the attention and that it needs and deserves to bring the war, violence and killing to an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
The history of war in Sudan, Deputy, is awful and bloody. It's also complex in relation to the parties to the war. We can talk about the RSF, we can talk about the government, we can also talk about various tribal militias who are agnostic in terms of who they side with in pursuit of their bloody aims. This conflict is of a scale perhaps unfathomable to this House, to be honest. It's as bad as anything that the continent has seen, and indeed, whilst we're living in really, really difficult geopolitical times, it is no underestimation to say this is possibly the worst conflict, but certainly the worst humanitarian disaster happening in the world at the moment. And it is a humanitarian disaster that is awful, but it's also having a real impact materially on the daily lives of the people that you and I represent in our constituencies. And we should never lose that focus from this is why it's the right thing for Ireland to be involved in this, to provide that support, but it is also the sensible thing as well.
Deputy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good assessment. It is unfathomable, and it is difficult because, you know, as complex as any conflict is, sometimes in relation to Russia-Ukraine, it's clear who the aggressor is, it's clear who we are supporting, it's clear what side we're on. It is far more complex in Sudan with the nature of the belligerents and both the short and long history of conflict there and the nature of the type of violence itself. So there are no easy answers here, and Ireland certainly doesn't have the capacity on its own to solve and bring this humanitarian crisis to an end, but it's just to ensure that the people in Sudan, the Sudanese people and their who are here know that the Irish Parliament and the Irish Government and the Irish State is doing everything that we can with our allies and partner states to try and end the violence and end the humanitarian disaster that's taken place. So thank you very much, Chair, and thank the Minister for his response.
I'm very grateful to the Deputy for raising the very large Sudanese population that live here in Ireland, because when we see things in the abstract, when we read reports, when we look at news reports and everything else, we forget that these are people's family members, these are people's friends, and these are people who are living in our constituencies who are worried about their family and friends and not knowing what the future holds. In terms of Ireland's role, there's three major things that we will continue to press. One is an absolute call with our partners for an immediate cessation in the violence. Secondly, it will be for the real enforcement of the arms embargoes that have been in place. And thirdly, and most importantly, it is the maintenance of our humanitarian support. As I said, we've allocated €4.3 million this year. That included an additional €3 million that was announced by myself and the Taoiseach in New York in September at the UN General Assembly, but also a real pressure to make sure that humanitarian corridors are maintained. I've said it before in the House, 2025 is the most dangerous, deadly year to be a humanitarian aid worker in the world. The deaths of humanitarian workers in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine are unfathomable.
Okay, we'll take now the last question of the morning to the Minister, and that's question 14, Deputy Doherty.
Minister, the family of Michael Leonard have now waited more than 50 years for the truth about how Michael was killed by the RUC in the Donegal-Fermanagh border in 1973. Now, new evidence contradicts the original account and raises serious questions. We now have a change in landscape in Britain. The old Legacy Act has been dismantled and a new legacy structures are being put in place. Minister, in light of these developments, have you raised Michael Leonard's case with the British Government, or do you intend to raise it in a timely fashion?
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. The case of the person in question, Michael, and the family's desire for answers has been raised on a number of occasions at ministerial level with the UK Government. following new evidence unearthed, as you've mentioned. Since the dismissal of the initial inquest in 1973, the Attorney-General for Northern Ireland ordered a fresh inquest into the person in question's death on the 30th of April 24. Unfortunately, this new inquest was never commenced due to the UK Legacy Act introduced in May of 24. The Joint Framework on Legacy, which was announced just this September 19th by two governments, fundamentally reforms the 23 UK Legacy Act. It aims to provide a pathway to truth and accountability and, to the extent possible, justice for those most affected by the violence of the Troubles. It lifts the ban on inquests and provides a way forward for those inquests, such as the inquest of Michael, which was ordered but not commenced before the 23rd Act. Once the implementing UK legislation has been passed and enacted, Michael's question, the person in question's or Michael's case will be independently assessed by the UK Solicitor General to consider whether it would be most appropriately dealt with by the Reformed Legacy Commission or via the coronial system. The assessment will be carried out on the basis of specific criteria set out in legislation, including the views of families and the next of kin. Too many families in Northern Ireland have waited far too long for truth and accountability. My focus is now on making sure that the process established by the joint framework are up and running as soon as possible. I have already engaged with Hilary Benn on this particular issue, but also more broadly in ensuring that we can continue to strengthen and evolve relationships north, south, east and west. And I look forward to meeting, I hope soon, with Yvette Cooper as well, and making sure that those relations are strong and that all matters can be discussed. I look forward to working with victims as well and survivor groups closely over the coming months, as well as with those political parties in Northern Ireland, to ensure that the Reformed Legacy Commission, once set up, has the ability to command the confidence of victims and survivors of the Troubles.
Deputy.
Thank you, Minister, for your answer. And you may be aware I've raised this issue countless times with government and your predecessors, and I'm sure you're aware of the circumstances of the case. You've said that you've raised this with Hilary Benn, and I think you'll agree it is worth raising again. Michael was a 24-year-old Donegal man. He was shot in the back and killed by the RUC on the border of Brookhill and Fermanagh near Pettigo. For decades, the official narrative was that he was shot by a single shot that was fired accidentally by the RUC. New evidence uncovered in 2023 in British Army logs by researchers have since exposed that at least 3 shots were discharged by a member of the RUC, contradicting the original account and raising profound questions about the circumstances of his death. At that time in 2023, the Leonard family came here to Leinster House to ask for help from the government, and they deserve to finally have answers to their questions. I welcome the fact that you say that you've raised the case with Hilary Benn. What are the next steps that you, on behalf of the government, will take in relation to the case of Michael Leonard?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Deputy, I mean, this is very clearly a case that has been ongoing for some time, and what's important is that families, and that Michael's family in particular, get answers. Once the commitment in the joint framework are translated faithfully into legislation, I think the Legacy Commission will look and feel somewhat different to what we've had in the past. The governance and oversight structures will be much clearer, they'll be stronger, they'll hopefully lead to greater independence, and then investigations can be carried out to recognised standards with statutory conflict of interest provisions to address real and perceived conflicts of interest. Importantly, a statutory victims and survivors advisory group will be established, ensuring that their voices are heard and that they remain very much front and centre of this overall process. What I can say is that the publication and the second reading of the bill and the amendment to the Legacy Act is moving forward. I welcome the speed at which the British Government has brought forward the bill. It demonstrates, I think, the seriousness with which the Secretary of State and his colleagues are approaching this absolutely essential work. The test will obviously be to see does it faithfully reflect the agreement that was reached in September, but I have every confidence in my initial engagement with Hilary and with others that they are working to ensure that this reflects faithfully the agreement that was put in place, but most importantly that we can progress with the elements of the legislation that will hopefully give answers to Michael's family, but many others as well.
Deputy Minister, the Legacy Act, as you're aware, that came into existence in Britain on May the 1st of 2024, shut down an inquest into Michael's killing. Incredibly, it shut it down just hours after it was granted by the Attorney General. The case was an example of the cruelty of Britain's Legacy Act writ large. As well as the new evidence, the Attorney General granted the inquiry on the basis that the original inquest did not receive oral evidence from any of the RUC officers involved in the killing. Given the circumstances that this new evidence came just too late before the Cruel Legacy Act was enacted, it is vital that the inquest into Michael's death is reopened. It is important that whatever happens in relation to the negotiations and the phases of the framework for dealing with these matters, that the inquiry into the killing of Michael Leonard is reopened. The family aren't looking, as you know, for special treatment, but what they do deserve are answers and justice for Michael. As I've said, I welcome the fact that you have raised this, and I'm asking you to continue to raise this. There are far too many cases where families have campaigned for decades, in this case for half a century, for the truth and justice, and I'm asking the government support them in their quest. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Deputy, I think in any engagement with our counterparts in the north in the UK, that we focus on the fact that these are families and that these are tragedies that I suppose we haven't gotten answers to and for, and that needs to be front and centre in everything that we do. I think we've turned a corner in terms of our own relations with the UK, and I can see that clearly over the last number of years through my time as Minister for Justice, the councils that I sit on, and the engagement to date, in particular with Secretary of State Hilary Benn. Again, to stress, the joint framework removes the Legacy Act's prohibition on inquests that you've mentioned, so this will utterly change the landscape that we've been working with and that has prevented so many of these inquests from taking place. Inquests which were halted by the Legacy Act will recommence. Inquests that had been ordered but had not begun, such as the inquest into the death of Michael Leonard, will be subject to a further decision by the UK Solicitor General on whether they would be appropriately dealt with, as I mentioned earlier, as an ordinary inquest via the coronial system or via the inquisitorial mechanism, which will sit under the Reformed Legacy Commission. So the important thing now is that the legislation is enacted. We will obviously follow through and enact our own legislation here once that is the case.
Thank you,
it's
Minister.
about getting those bodies and those institutions set up so that we can provide answers to families.
That brings